everybody, and welcome to Chapter 33 of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Pandemonium reigned in the church below Maddie as the foxes started to move toward the stairway leading to the gallery. There was a clamor of voices, all shouting at once. Damone screamed at them, his voice cracking with the strain. "Up there! In the gallery! Catch him!" With a sense of horror, Maddie realized she was cut off. There was no way she could reach the door with the flood of men mounting the stairs. It was their haste that gave her a little breathing space. Too many of them tried to climb the old stairs at the same time, forgetting that the timbers might not be sound. There was an ugly cracking noise as two of the steps gave way and collapsed, sending four of the climbers tumbling down. They, in turn, brought down several more men, and for some moments there was a jam of bodies at the foot of the stairs. Then, one of them, with more sense than the others, took control. He shoved the struggling bodies away from the steps, reached up to the railing, and hauled himself carefully over the two broken risers. "Take it easy," he shouted. "One at a time. Move slowly." She could hear the more measured sounds of feet on the stairs now, and looked around desperately, seeking a way out. For a moment, she considered lowering herself over the balustrade and dropping down into the main part of the abbey, but she discarded the idea. There were still men milling about down there, and she'd be captured in an instant. The only alternative was the window on the far wall. It was a fixed window, made from small glass panes, tinted several colors, and arranged to create a pattern on the floor of the church when the light shone through them. At the moment, with the inside of the church lit, the glass appeared dark and forbidding. The glass sections were held in place by a framework of lead strips, she knew, but the windows was old, and she hoped that the lead strips would be weak and fragile. Otherwise, she would be badly injured when she tried to break through, which was what she planned to do. There was no time to think about it any further. It was her only avenue of escape, and already she could see the head and shoulders of the first of her pursuers appearing above the floor level, where the stairway opened into the gallery. She rose to her feet, gathered her cloak around her, and ran full tilt at the window. At the last minute, she tucked her head in, protecting it with her folded arms and her cloak, and drove herself head first at the center of the window. Vaguely, she heard the man who had come up the stairs shouting a warning to his companions below. Then she hit the panel of stained glass. The spiderweb of lead strips holding the glass in place was old and brittle, as she had hoped. She burst through the window with a splintering crash, showering glass and lead fragments out into the night. It was a 3-meter drop to the ground below, and she felt herself toppling as she fell. She tucked her head in and twisted so that she struck the ground on her shoulder and rolled to absorb as much of the impact as she could. Even so, she was badly winded by the impact, and it took her several seconds to come to her feet and regain her breath. Above her, the man who had led the way up the stairs leaned out through the shattered window, yelling for those below to cut her off. The door was 5 meters away from her, and as she dragged huge gulps of air into her lungs, 4 men burst out into the open. They hesitated, their eyes not accustomed to the darkness outside after the bright torchlight in the abbey. Then one of them saw her and pointed. "There he is!" But they were between her and the spot where she had left Bumper. She had no choice. She turned and ran for the back of the abbey as they came after her. Going this way was taking her farther and farther away from her horse, but there was no alternative. She heard the man at the window yelling more instructions as she rounded the back of the building, but she couldn't make out the words. The rush of blood in her ears and her own ragged breathing drowned them out. She paused, leaning against the stone wall, and tried to whistle for Bumper, but her mouth was dry, and her breath came raggedly, and she could make no sound. Then, 3 more of the foxes burst around the corner of the wall ahead of her, and she realized what the man at the window had been shouting. He had been directing them to cut her off. The church was built close to the trees on this side, with only a narrow gap between the stone walls and the dense forest growth. She was hemmed in to a narrow space barely 5 meters wide, and there was no way she could cut around them. She reached for her sacks and drew it, determined to take some of them with her. She couldn't hope to defeat the 3 men facing her, and the other 4 coming from behind her. The 3 men blocking her way hesitated for a second or two, then charged toward her. 2 of them had swords, and the 3rd was armed with a heavy club. She set her feet, the sacks ready, although she knew she had little hope of fending off 3 attackers at once, all armed with weapons with a longer reach than her own. Then a shaggy form burst around the corner of the church, behind the men. The first of them heard the hooves drumming behind him and began to turn, but Bumper slammed his shoulder into him and sent him flying. He dealt with a second in the same way, crashing into him with a sickening thud. The man went down and stayed down. The 3rd man was armed with the club. He turned and crouched, swinging wildly at the horse as it danced around him. Then Bumper saw his chance, and, pirouetting neatly, set his front feet on the ground and kicked out with his back legs, driving them into the man with a solid whoop. The force of the impact picked the man up and hurled him against the stone wall of the church. He slid down the rough stones and lay senseless on the ground. Bumper, looking extremely pleased with himself, trotted to where Matty leaned against the wall, her shoulders heaving as she still sought to refill her tortured lungs. "Good boy, good boy," she groaned, as he stood alongside her. She reached up and caught hold of the pommel, but for the moment she simply didn't have the strength to mount. "There he is!" Her original 4 pursuers came into sight. Wary of a possible ambush, they had held back from chasing her too closely, content for their companions to cut her off from the other direction. Now, seeing her leaning against the stocky horse, they came after her with renewed energy. "Run," she ordered Bumper. He turned and accelerated away as only a ranger horse could. She lifted her feet as she clung to the pommel, hanging beside him as he galloped down the narrow passage between the church and the trees. 2 more men appeared before them, and the little horse simply shouldered them aside as he'd done to their comrades. They cried out in pain and surprise as he sent them sprawling on the ground. There were other men confronting them now, but they had seen what had happened to their comrades, and they leapt out of the way, registering only at the last minute that the horse, which appeared riderless, was actually carrying their quarry, clinging desperately to the saddle. "You'd better get mounted." "I'm trying, believe me," she gasped. Judging his speed and the rhythm of his movement, she let her feet come down to touch the ground and thrust upward with her bent knees, at the same instant heaving herself up with her arms. She rolled up and across his back, clinging desperately to the saddle, while she managed to get a leg on either side of his stocky body. Her feet found the stirrups, and she settled more firmly into the saddle. The reins were somewhere on his neck, but she didn't have time to find them. She grabbed a handful of his mane and bent low over his back as they sped out of the clearing and into the trees. Dimly, she registered that they were heading south, away from the castle, but there was nothing she could do about that. Behind her, she could hear Damone's voice, shouting for his men to get their horses and go after her. "We can worry about the castle later," she thought. "For now, we've just got to get away." She made no attempt to direct Bumper, trusting to his instinct and eyesight to guide them through the close-growing trees without reducing speed. Low branches whipped at her, 2 of them slashing across her face and bringing tears to her eyes before she could crouch down over his neck to avoid them. She clung on grimly as he swerved through the trees at a dead run, faster than she would have had the nerve to drive him. Eventually, she found the reins. The ends knotted together around his neck. but she held them loosely, not wanting to turn him one way or the other, content for him to choose his own path. He nickered appreciatively. "Just hold on. I'll get us out of here." Behind her, she could hear her pursuers shouting instructions to each other, and the thunder of hoofs as they rode through the trees behind her. But none of their horses was as sure-footed or sure-sighted as Bumper, and from time to time she heard the crash of collisions and shouts of pain and alarm as they blundered into the trees. The sound seemed to be falling away behind her, and eventually she twitched lightly on the reins to slow down her horse's breakneck speed. "All right," she said, "we've left them behind." Bumper instantly slowed from his headlong gallop to a fast trot. Now she could see the trees around them, and she sat up straighter in the saddle, scanning the ground in front of her. At last she saw what she was looking for, a narrow game trail that led south through the trees. "We'll follow this," she said, nudging him toward the trail with one knee. He grunted and responded, shoving aside the low undergrowth as he made his way onto the trail. The shouts and hoofbeats were still behind them, but not too close. She heaved a sigh of relief. "We'll keep going south until we're in the clear. Then we'll circle around them and head back to the castle," she told her horse. Again he grunted, concentrating on following the narrow game trail. Damone had told his men that they would launch their attack on the castle the following day. It was imperative that she get back there tonight, so she could warn her mother of his treachery. Then they could forestall his bold plan to simply lead his men across the drawbridge and into the castle. She realized that he had no idea that she had been the one hiding in the gallery. He had repeatedly called on his men to catch him. He might even think that she had been an itinerant tramp seeking shelter there, although the presence of her horse tended to work against that assumption. She was in a part of the fief she hadn't seen before, and realized that the ground beneath her was rising gradually. The trees were becoming more widely spaced as well, and she was conscious of low hills rising on either side of her as she rode on. They became progressively steeper and higher, and she realized that she was riding up a valley, wide at first, but becoming narrower the farther she went in, as the steep hills on either side closed in. Then Bumper came to an abrupt stop, and she looked up. A sheer rock wall barred the way in front of them. She swung Bumper to the right and cantered along it, seeking a way around. But there was none. The rock wall facing her abutted the steep side of the valley, leaving no way out. Desperately, she cantered back the other way, but found the same situation on the left side. The sides of the valley formed a solid U-shape, too steep to climb. With a sinking heart, she realized she was in a blind valley, with no way out other than the way she had come. She turned Bumper's head back downhill, but as she did so, she saw the flare of torches among the trees below her. Damone and his men were at the wide end of the valley. She was trapped. All right, that's going to bring us to the conclusion of Chapter 33. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time in Chapter 34. God bless, and have a good one.